Hotels can be pretty creepy when you're alone or when they're abandoned. I know I love staying in them, but there's always that eerie feeling, especially at night, when you're walking the halls and there's just no one around. Well, today we're gonna learn about the most disturbing cases that have happened in hotels. So make sure you have a snack and some water, and let's get into these horrifying hotels. Before we get into this, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this, or follow on Spotify if you're there, and also rate 5 stars on Spotify. Apparently that's important. And then also I have an Instagram and a Discord where we can hang out and talk. So yeah, all that in the description, but let's get into this. Hotel President. Kansas City, 1935. A 19-year-old kid from Birmingham, Alabama, named Artemis Ogletree had left home the year before to hitchhike across the country. He had set off with a friend named Joe Simpson in April 1934. They made it to Los Angeles and then they went their separate ways. By August, Artemis had made his way to Kansas City. At several stops along the way, police would later learn he'd been in the company of a man who signed hotel registries as Don Kelso. Nobody knows who this Don Kelso actually was though, and that's kind of the whole thing with this case. On the afternoon of January 2nd, 1935, a young man walked into the Hotel President in downtown Kansas City. He was well dressed, wearing a dark overcoat. He had no bags. His only luggage was a comb, a hairbrush, and some toothpaste in his coat pocket. He checked in under the name Roland T. Owen, gave a Los Angeles address, and asked specifically for an interior room on a high floor, one that faced the courtyard, not the street. Staff thought he looked like a boxer because of the cauliflower ear and a large hairless scar on the side of his head. He was given room 1046 on the 10th floor, and then things started getting weird almost immediately. The maid, Mary Soptic, came to clean his room and found him sitting inside in almost complete darkness, shades pulled, one dim lamp on. He was polite, he let her clean, he combed his hair while she worked. Before he left, he asked her to leave the door unlocked because he was expecting a friend in a few minutes. Her impression of him, which she later told police, was that he was either worried about something or afraid. She came back later that afternoon. The man was lying on the bed in the dark. On the desk beside him was a note that said, "Don, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." The next morning, she came back again. She found him sitting motionless in the darkened room again. While she cleaned, the phone rang and she overheard him tell whoever was on the line, who he called Don, that he wasn't going to be having breakfast that morning. Later that day, she came back with fresh towels. This time, the door was locked from the outside, so she used her passkey. Inside, she could hear 2 men talking. She knocked. A voice she didn't recognize, loud and deep, probably not the guest, asked who it was. She said she had fresh towels. The voice said, "We don't need any." She knew there were no towels in that room because she'd personally taken them herself that morning. The woman staying next door in room 1048 told police she heard men and women talking loudly and cursing late that night. An elevator operator said he had taken a woman up to the 10th floor that evening. He estimated that she was around 135 pounds, about 5.5 feet tall, dark hair, wearing a black coat. She was never identified. The morning of January 4th, the switchboard kept lighting up because the phone in room 1046 was off the hook. The first time was at 7 a.m. There was a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door. The bellboy, Randolph, knocked anyway, 3 times. No answer. He knocked again. A muffled voice, low and gruff, said, "Come in, turn on the lights." Randolph noted the voice didn't sound familiar. He entered and found the room empty except for what sounded like someone in the bathroom. He left. The phone kept going off the hook. By 11 a.m., they sent someone up again. They found him naked, slumped forward on the edge of the bathtub, covered in blood. He had been stabbed multiple times in the chest, stomach, and legs. His wrists were slashed. The back of his head was bludgeoned. A rope was tied around his neck, indicating attempted strangulation. There were blood spatters on the walls, the bed, and the bathroom. He was still alive somehow, barely. When the detective arrived and asked who did this, the man said nobody. When asked what happened, he said he fell and hit his head on the bathtub. Then he lost consciousness and was rushed to the hospital. He died that night. The Kansas City police chief at the time said the case, quote, "came nearer to being the perfect crime than than any other murder Kansas City had seen in his quarter century as a detective. Police searched the room. His clothes were missing. Everything was gone. The key to his room was missing. They found what appeared to be a woman's fingerprint on the phone stand. Whoever had been in that room had cleaned it out completely before leaving, and they had no idea who the dead man even was. Roland T. Owen didn't exist. There was no record of any such man having lived anywhere in the United States. They circulated his photo nationwide. Tips came in. People identified the body as their cousin, their brother, their neighbor. None of the identification stuck though. His body sat in a Kansas City funeral home for weeks. Then, 11 weeks after his death, police announced they were going to bury the unidentified man in a pauper's grave. They got an anonymous phone call. A man asked them to bury him properly in Memorial Park Cemetery, said he'd pay for it, refused to identify himself, and before hanging up said Owen hadn't played the game fair. Cheaters always get what's coming to them. The money arrived in an envelope days later. On the day of the funeral, 13 roses arrived at the graveside with a card that read, "Love forever, Luis." Nobody knows who paid for the funeral. Nobody knows who Luis is. A woman called the newspaper to tell them the story about a pauper's burial was wrong, that he'd gotten a proper funeral. When they asked to identify herself, she said, "Never mind, I know what I'm talking about." When they pressed her, she said, "He got into a jam," and hung up. Then, in spring of 1935, typed letters started arriving at an Alabama family's home. The letters claimed to be from their son who'd been traveling the country. The son said he was sailing to Europe, then heading to Cairo. Later, a phone call came from a man claiming to be a friend, saying the son had saved his life from a band of thugs in Egypt and was happy and married and wouldn't be writing anymore because he'd lost his thumb in a bar fight. The family was suspicious of the letters from the start because their son didn't know how to type. In 1936, a friend showed Ruby Ogletree, a woman from Birmingham, Alabama, a newspaper article about the unidentified murder victim in Kansas City. The face in the photo looked exactly like her son Artemis, who she hadn't heard from since 1934 when he left to hitchhike to California. She recognized the scar on the side of his head. It was from a childhood accident with hot grease. She contacted Kansas City police. They confirmed it. The dead man in 1046 was her son, Artemis Ogletree, 19 years old, from Birmingham, Alabama. While she had been receiving typed letters telling her he was alive and traveling the world, he had been dead in a Kansas City cemetery for over a year. Ruby started putting things together. She tracked down Joe Simpson, the friend who had hitchhiked with Artemis. She asked him directly about the phone call from Memphis. He turned red, dropped his eyes, and got nervous. He'd claimed to have a letter from Artemis. He promised to bring it to her, but he never showed up. Ruby later recalled him saying about the case, quote, "It is, they'll never get the ones who killed him," unquote. She looked him square in the eyes and told him she would know the voice that had talked to her from Memphis, but nothing came of it. Then, in 1937, something interesting happened. New York City police arrested a man named Joseph Martin, also known as Joseph Ogden, for killing a man he shared a room with and shipping the body in a trunk addressed to Memphis, Tennessee. Among the many aliases he'd used was Donald Kelso. Kansas City police matched samples of his handwriting to the typed letters sent to Ruby Ogletree. The FBI investigated. No charges were ever filed in the Ogletree case. Joseph Ogden had been using the name Donald Kelso while in the Kansas City area around the same time Artemis Ogletree was killed. Someone with that name had checked into a hotel alongside Ogletree just days before his death. He was sentenced to 20 years to life for the other murder. He spent the rest of his life in and out of prisons and insane asylums. Whether he killed Artemis Ogletree was never proven. In the early 2000s, a historian at the Kansas City Public Library who had been writing about the case got a phone call from someone out of state. The caller said they had been going through the belongings of a recently deceased elderly person and found a box containing newspaper clippings about the Ogletree murder, and one other item that kept being mentioned in the stories. The caller refused to say what the item was. The hotel president still operates today. It's now the Hilton President Kansas City. You can book a room there. The case is technically still open. Nobody's ever been charged. Nobody knows who Don was, who Luis was, who paid for the funeral, who sent the typed letters, or why a 19-year-old kid from Alabama checked into a Kansas City hotel under a fake name with nothing but a comb and a toothbrush and spent his last days sitting alone in the dark waiting for someone. Everyone knows the Cecil Hotel at this point, which is kind of a shame because right around the corner from it is the Barclay Hotel, and nobody talks about that one. It has 2 serial killers, a suspicious fire, and a history that goes back even further. It just never got a Netflix documentary, so here we are. The Barclay opened in 1897 as the Van Nuys Hotel, named after its original owner, Isaac Newton Van Nuys. It was the first hotel in Los Angeles to have electricity and a telephone in every single room, and that was a genuine selling point in 1897. It had a grand staircase that people who have seen old photos of it compare to the Titanic. It's the oldest continuously operating hotel in Los Angeles. It predates the Cecil by about 30 years. In 1929, the lease was acquired by Consolidated Hotels Inc., and the name was changed to the Barclay, and the dining room was closed. By the Depression, it was already being described in newspapers as seedy. The neighborhood around it, which became Skid Row, was deteriorating. The hotel went from hosting very important people to housing transients, and once that happened, very bad things started following each other in. So there were some murders that happened. First, we're going to talk about this guy named Otto Stephen Wilson. A few days before the murders, Wilson left his employment at a shipyard near Wilmington, California. Shortly before noon on November 14th, he went to a hardware store in Los Angeles and bought a knife with about a 7-inch blade. That's important, remember that. He bought it before he found her, and he already knew what he was going to do. That night, he met a woman named Virgie Lee Griffin at a bar on Main Street and took her to the Barclay Hotel, where they registered as Mr. and Mrs. O.S. Wilson. He told the front desk his wife was drunk and needed a room for a couple of hours to sober up. But once in the room, he started by choking her and then stabbed her several times. For over an hour, he sat naked on the bed with Virgie's body and attempted to remove her arms and legs with a razor. When he found it too difficult to carry out his planned dissections, he left the room and went to a movie. He went to the $1 Million Theater a few blocks away. The film was called The Walking Dead. Before he left the room, he tipped the maid $1 and told her his wife didn't want to be disturbed. Later, the maid entered the room and found the body cut open from throat to pelvis, one leg severed and the breast slashed off. To the cops, the room looked like a slaughterhouse. Wilson went from the movie theater to a bar. While sitting there with a glass of wine, he spotted another woman and followed her to a second hotel called the Joyce, a few blocks away, where he killed her the same night. Police caught him a few hours later. A patrolman noticed a man in a nearby bar fitting the suspect description. In the man's hand was a book of matches from the Barclay Hotel. The officer walked over. The man looked up and said, "What do you want?" And the officer said this and slapped handcuffs on his wrist. As he was being searched at the police station, Wilson tried to get the officer to throw away the matchbook. When that didn't work, he threw it under a chair himself. His name was Otto Stephen Wilson. He confessed immediately. His ex-wife had previously told naval authorities that he once waited for her to get out of the shower, slashed her with a razor, and then licked the blood. God. The Navy discharged him for sexual psychosis. He had been out of prison for less than a month when he walked into the Barclay. Otto Stephen Wilson was found guilty of both slayings and sentenced to death. On September 20th, 1946, he was executed in California's gas chamber. Next, we're going to talk about Von Orrin Greenwood, aka the Skid Row Slasher. This one starts a full decade before the Barclay Hotel even comes into it. On November 13th, 1964, the first known victim, an aging transient named David Russell, was found on the library steps with his throat cut and numerous stab wounds. The following day, 67-year-old Benjamin Hornberg was killed in the second-floor restroom of his hotel, throat slashed from ear to ear, numerous stab wounds marking his head and upper torso. Police noticed a pattern and then it just stopped. No more murders. The case went cold. What had happened was Greenwood had been caught trying to kill someone in Chicago and spent several years in an Illinois prison. When he got out, though, he came straight back to Los Angeles. On December 1st, 1974, he murdered a 46-year-old alcoholic drifter named Charles Jackson on the exact spot where David Russell had been killed a decade earlier. Then it started happening fast. Over the next 2 months, 9 more people were killed across Skid Row. All of them had their throats cut from ear to ear. Every body was found with a ring of salt around the corpse and cups of blood nearby. There's evidence actually that the killer drank the blood of his victims. The items left around the body led many to believe the murders were linked to Satanism. Nobody knew who was doing it. Police had put out a profile of the suspect as a white male in his late 20s with long blonde hair. The final Skid Row victim, 49-year-old Samuel Soares, was killed indoors. His body found in a 5th-floor hotel room. That hotel was the Barclay, room 528. Then something strange happened. The killer suddenly switched to Hollywood, killing 2 people in their apartments. Then he tried to break into a house. A prowler invaded the Hollywood home of William Graham, assaulting him with a hatchet before a house guest intervened and both men plunged through a plate glass window. The attacker fled on foot, striking next at the home of actor Burt Reynolds, carefully dropping a letter addressed to himself in the driveway. Police picked up Vaughn Greenwood, charging him with counts of burglary and assault. He was 31 years old, black, with short hair, nothing like the profile. On December 30th, 1976, he was convicted on 9 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, the judge recommending he never be released because his presence in any community would constitute a menace. And he died recently in prison in December 2020. Now, those are the 2 most famous things, but a researcher named J.M. Moore, who actually lived in the Barclay for 7 years, went through some old coroner's reports and newspaper archives and found about 20 different deaths in the building's history. The early years of the hotel saw several horrifying elevator accidents. The early electrical systems were primitive, and the deaths they caused were gruesome enough to make newspaper front pages. On December 29th, 1937, a wealthy woman named Elizabeth Reese checked into the Barclay. 3 days later, she was found by an employee sitting in a chair with her skull cracked from an apparent attack with a brick found on her bed. Reports never actually made it clear whether she survived. In March 1972, a fire broke out on the top floor of the building while 132 guests were staying there. 3 people were killed and 7 were injured. The circumstances of the fire remain suspicious. In 2021, the building was converted into low-income housing by the Healthy Housing Foundation, with 158 units offered at between $400 and $750 a month. You can still visit the lobby. The original stained glass windows from 1897 are still there with the Van Nuys family crest on them. The name Van Nuys is still carved into the outside of the building, and somewhere in the back of the building, the original hotel safe from 1897 survives. The size of a wardrobe, painted with the Van Nuys family name and a seagoing scene, with half its compartments still locked, and nobody knows what's inside. Next, we're gonna talk about the Murder Castle in Chicago, which, yes, is a hotel. Just wait, trust me. His real name was Herman Webster Mudgett. He was born on May 16th, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. He was smart, weird, and from a pretty young age, clearly not right in the way that's hard to put your finger on until it's too late. There were signs early. He expressed an unusual interest in medicine that reportedly led him to practice surgery on animals. And some accounts suggest that he may have been responsible for the death of a childhood friend, but nobody could prove anything. He was just a kid. He graduated high school early and eventually transferred to the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, graduating in June 1884. And it was at medical school where the grifting actually started in earnest. While enrolled, Holmes stole cadavers from the laboratory, burned or disfigured them, and then planted the bodies, making it look as if they'd been killed in accident. Having previously taken out insurance policies on fictitious people so he could collect the money once the bodies were discovered. He was running this scheme in his 20s in medical school and nobody caught him, and that should tell you a lot about who this person was. Holmes moved to Chicago in August 1886, which is when he began using the name H.H. Holmes. He took a job at a pharmacy on the corner of Wallace and 63rd Street in the Englewood neighborhood, working for a woman named Dr. E.S. Holton, who was dealing with her husband's terminal illness. Holmes convinced Holton's wife to sell him the store, assuring her she could continue living upstairs after her husband died. She didn't live there long. After Dr. Holton died, Holmes murdered Mrs. Holton, disposed of her body, and told her friends and family that she had moved to California. He had been in Chicago for less than a year. He now owned a pharmacy, and across the street there was an empty lot. Holmes purchased the lot and began construction on what would become his most infamous project, a large labyrinth building with shops on the first floor and apartments above. The building, which newspapers would eventually call the Murder Castle, was not, as the legend goes, a purpose-built torture facility with 100 rooms, gas chambers piped into every room, trapdoors everywhere, and secret chutes chutes dropping bodies directly into a basement crematorium. According to Adam Selzer, author of H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, there are really only about 9 victims we can say with any confidence that Holmes actually killed. He confessed to 27 at some point, but several of those people were actually verifiably still alive at the time he confessed. The claims of up to 200 murders likely originated from a pulp book published in 1940 that included a throwaway line suggesting the number could be that high. The yellow press labeled the building as Holmes' murder castle, claiming the structure contained secret torture chambers, trapdoors, gas chambers, and a basement crematorium. None of these sensationalized claims were true. There were a couple of secret passages and hidden rooms, but they weren't so secret that everybody who lived and worked in the building didn't know about them, and they were typically used to hide stolen property. So why did the building look weird and maze-like? Because Holmes engaged in extensive construction fraud while building it, firing workers before they could learn too much, refusing to pay suppliers, and lying to investors. Which is why the building was never properly finished and the layout made no sense. The irregular architecture was a product of scamming, not sadism really. Having said all of that, the real story of what actually happened there and what Holmes actually did is still completely horrifying. It's just horrifying in a different way. In 1892, Holmes added a 3rd floor to the building and advertised it as hotel space, specifically to capitalize on the upcoming World's Columbian Exposition, the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. The fair ran from May to October 1893 and attracted over 150,000 visitors from around the world. It was the largest event in American history up to that point. People were pouring into Chicago from everywhere, many of them young women looking for work, many of them traveling alone, most of them in a city they didn't know. Holmes took advantage of the influx of visitors by advertising in local newspapers, referring to his establishment as the World's Fair Hotel. He attended the fair himself, impeccably dressed, charming, and looking for targets. He enticed wealthy women with promises of work and accommodation. He had an extraordinary ability to make people trust him. Everyone who encountered him described the same thing. He was magnetic, warm, and attentive. He looked at you in the eye and made you feel like the only person in the room. All of Holmes' employees, hotel guests, fiancés, and wives were required to have life insurance policies. Holmes paid the premium as long as they listed him as the beneficiary. He was married at least 3 times, possibly 4, none of which he bothered to divorce from before marrying the next. His various wives and mistresses had a habit of disappearing. When people asked where they'd gone, Holmes always had an answer. Moved to California, or traveling in Europe, or starting fresh somewhere new. People believed him because he was, again, the kind of person that you just trusted. Among his confirmed victims were women who came to him for work and never left. A bookkeeper named Julia Smith, who was living in the building with her husband and daughter, began having an affair with Holmes. After her husband found out and left, both Julia and her daughter Pearl disappeared at Christmas 1891. Then, in early 1893, a woman named Minnie Williams moved to Chicago after Holmes offered her a job as his personal secretary. Holmes persuaded her to sign over the deed to her property in Fort Worth, Texas, to him. Her sister Nanny came to visit in July. Neither Minnie nor Nanny were seen alive after July 5th, 1893. Holmes would dissect his victims, strip them of their flesh, and sell their bones to medical schools as human skeleton models. Bodies were disposed of in acid baths or burned. In one pile of ash, investigators found a small gold chain from a woman's shoe. The World's Fair ended in October 1893. Holmes left Chicago shortly after. On August 13th, 1893, the 3rd floor of the building had caught fire. Holmes had taken out insurance policies on the building with at least 4 companies, which promptly sued rather than pay. He spent the next year moving across the country, continuing his fraud schemes under various fake names, and he was too arrogant to stop. But then, the thing that finally got him was greed and a prison conversation. Holmes had a longtime associate named Benjamin Petezel, who had a wife and 5 children. The plan was for Petezel to fake his own death so his wife could collect $10,000 in life insurance policy from the Fidelity Mutual Life Insurance Company, which Holmes and Petezel would split. Holmes was supposed to find a cadaver to stand in for the body. Instead, he just killed Petezel. He got Petezel drunk and set him on fire after he passed out, then collected the insurance money and told Petezel's wife that her husband was still alive and hiding somewhere safe. Then, afraid that Petezel's children might figure out what had happened to their father, Holmes killed all three of them, Alice, Nellie, and Howard Petersall, while traveling with their mother across the country, staying one step ahead of investigators, with the children's mother completely unaware that her kids were already dead. The mother was traveling with Holmes thinking that they were going to be reunited with her husband. Holmes was traveling at the time with 3 children's bodies. While in jail at one point for a separate fraud, Holmes had confided in his insurance scheme to a fellow inmate named Marion Hedgepeth, who later went to authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. That tip started the unraveling. Philadelphia detective Frank Geyer began following Holmes's trail across America. Holmes was arrested in Boston on November 17, 1894. In the course of the investigation, Geyer uncovered the remains of the 3 Petersall children. Holmes was convicted of Benjamin Petersall's murder and sentenced to death. He confessed to 27 murders before his execution, though many of those confessions were either about people who were still alive or appeared to be fabricated entirely. He was a liar till the end. His explanation to himself was, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." His final wish was to be buried under a substantial amount of concrete because he didn't want his body to be disturbed. Holmes, who had spent his career stealing, disfiguring, and selling other people's bodies, was terrified of the same thing happening to him. His request was honored. In 1895, the murder castle was gutted by fire after witnesses reportedly saw 2 men entering the building late one night. Whether this was arson to destroy evidence or something else was never established. The building itself remained standing until 1938 when it was demolished. The site is now occupied by a US post office. There is one genuinely strange thing though. Holmes's descendants, over a century later, became concerned that rumors about him faking his own death might actually be true. Holmes's body was exhumed to put the mystery to rest. The concrete he'd requested to be poured over his grave had to be jackhammered through. DNA confirmed it was him. He really did die, he just couldn't stop being strange about it. The Mar Road International Hotel is a transit hotel right next to Narita Airport, about 40 miles outside Tokyo. It's where you stay when you have an early morning connection and you don't want to deal with the commute. Nothing remarkable about it really. Views of the runway, a gym, a sauna, solid 3.5 stars on most booking sites. But room 1272 is a different situation. To understand what happened there, you need to know who Koji Takahashi was first. He was born in 1938, lost vision in his right eye at 14 in an airgun accident, and grew up to become a tax accountant. Normal life, normal job. Then, in 1983, he founded a self-enlightenment organization named LifeSpace, charging participants up to $5,000 per course for seminars where they role-played as beggars or blind people to learn new perspectives on life. This sounds strange, but in 1980s Japan, the self-improvement seminar industry was genuinely enormous, and LifeSpace at its peak was one of the 3 biggest. It attracted nearly 10,000 people to its programs. Burned out corporate workers, university students, people looking for something. The courses were expensive and people responded to them. Then the recession hit in the early 90s, enrollment dropped, and Takahashi started getting weird about it. Facing declining numbers, he took the organization in a more spiritual direction and started claiming supernatural powers. He said he'd follow the Indian healer Sai Baba through 6,000 years of reincarnation and had mastered Sai Baba's healing technique, a method of curing illness by lightly tapping his palms on a patient's head and body, transferring his energy into them. He called this Shakti Pats. He charged several million yen per session. By 1999, he was publicly describing himself as a superhuman being who didn't need to eat, wash, or sleep. He also had already gotten someone killed. In 1995, a university student died during a LifeSpace seminar, a hot bath practice in a course called Vision 1. The student had paid $4,200 for it. His parents sued. LifeSpace turned around and started suing newspapers and individuals for calling them a cult, which backfired completely and just confirmed in the public mind exactly what they were. But throughout all of this, none of it slowed Takahashi down. In late June 1999, a 66-year-old LifeSpace follower named Shinichi Kobayashi slipped in his bathroom in Osaka, was knocked unconscious, and was taken to hospital where doctors identified a life-threatening cerebral hemorrhage. He needed real medical care. he was told he couldn't be moved. Takahashi, though, said otherwise. Quote, "If he keeps staying at the hospital, he will be a plaything of the hospital," he reportedly told Kobayashi's son, Kenji. What Shinichi Kobayashi needed was Shakti Pats, according to him. The family paid 8 million yen, roughly $67,000, for the treatment. 8 days after the accident, Kobayashi's 31-year-old son and 2 other cult members removed him from the hospital against doctors' orders, put him in a wheelchair, flew him to Narita, and checked him into the Marode International Hotel. According to the court ruling, Shinichi Kobayashi died 3 days later, but then they stayed in the room with him for 4 months. Takahashi had an explanation for every sign of death. When followers reported the patient had no pulse, he told them blood is not what keeps the body alive, it's air. When maggots appeared in the corpse, he said they were ascetic ticks, a sign of holiness in the Hindu faith. And people believed him because they had been trained over years and thousands of dollars to believe him about everything. Takahashi was also so certain he was performing a miracle that he wanted it documented. He had followers write a detailed account of the entire process. It ran to 5 volumes and 2,000 pages. It was titled, quote, "Father and son's bonds are connected at once when the son nurses the father." Newsweek later obtained a copy. By the middle of the first volume, the subject is clearly already dead, but the document just keeps going. And it wasn't only adults in that room. 8 girls aged 9 to 17 were brought from LifeSpace facilities to the hotel to tend to the body. They wiped it clean and changed the linen, caring for it as if it were still alive. Other cult children were living in separate hotel rooms nearby, given roughly $10 a day to get their own food, largely unsupervised. Hotel staff had been trying to get the guests in room 1272 to check out for 4 months. They refused maid service, ignored management's requests to vacate, and hid from staff. At some point, the smell made the situation impossible to keep ignoring, and the hotel called the police. When officers entered on November 11th, 1999, they found a bathrobe-clad corpse lying on a bed in candlelight, attended by 2 cult members. "Don't touch," said one of them. "He's still alive." Coroners concluded the man had been dead for as long as 4 months. The body was described as mummified. Takahashi held a press conference. In a rambling 3-hour interview with Newsweek, he said, quote, "I'm not as crazy as someone who would treat a dead man. Do you think I'm that crazy?" He accused the police of having killed Kobayashi themselves by removing the body and stopping the treatment. He was charged with murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. In 2003, an appellate court commuted this to 7 years after determining the killing had not been intentional, that he had genuinely believed he could cure the man. Kobayashi's son, Kenji, received 2.5-year suspended sentence for removing his father from the hospital and denying him medical care. After the trial, Kenji cut ties with Takayashi entirely. That's good. LifeSpace's membership, which had been around 10,000 at its peak, collapsed to roughly 150 after the case became public. The Marode International Hotel still operates. You can book a room there if you want. Guests since 1999 have reported hearing strange noises when no one else is around. Given that the hotel is next to one of the busiest airports in Asia, strange noises are probably not in short supply. Whether any of them are coming from room 1272, though, is something that you'd have to find out for yourself. Oxford is one of those places that people picture in a very specific way. Old university buildings, cobblestones, punting on the river. What they don't usually picture is the medieval castle that spent the better part of 1,000 years as one of England's most notorious prisons, which you can now check into, sleep in a converted cell, and order room service from. Oxford Castle was built starting in 1071 by Norman Baron Robert de Oyle, who arrived in England with William the Conqueror during the Norman Conquest. It started as a wooden Motte and Bailey structure, got replaced in stone over the following centuries, and by the 14th century had basically become the county's administrative center and default place to put people you didn't know what else to do with. The chapel built inside the castle in 1074, St. George's Chapel, is widely believed to be the seed from which Oxford University itself eventually grew. One of its early scholars was a Welsh monk named Geoffrey of Monmouth, who in 1136 wrote one of the earliest versions of the King Arthur legend. So the building where we're gonna find out people were later tortured and executed also gave us the Round Table, which is very Oxford. So this prison, the Oxford Castle, from the 14th century until 1577, it hosted the local Oxford assizes, the traveling court sessions. The abrupt end of that arrangement was caused by the plague, which tore through an entire court session, killing the Lord Lieutenant of Oxfordshire, 2 knights, a descendant of the castle's original founder, 80 other gentlemen, and the entire grand jury. 1 court session. Everyone died. They moved the courts after that, reasonably enough. After the English Civil War, the castle became Oxford's primary prison. The owners, Christ Church College, yes, the university owned the prison, leased it to private wardens who made a profit by charging prisoners for their board and lodging. You paid to be imprisoned, and if you couldn't pay, conditions got considerably worse. In the 1770s, prison reformer John Howard visited several times and condemned the place as vermin-infested and unfit for human habitation. The government took it over and built a new prison on the site from 1785 onward, which became H.M. Prison Oxford. Public hangings took place in the castle yard and drew large crowds until 1863, when executions were moved indoors. The prison closed officially in 1996 and was redeveloped as a hotel and visitor attraction. That's the building, and now for the people. December 14th, 1650, a 22-year-old domestic servant named Anne Green was hanged at Oxford Castle. She had been prosecuted by her employer, Sir Thomas Reed, after she miscarried alone in a privy at 17 weeks, tried to conceal the fetal remains, and was charged with infanticide under a 1624 law that presumed concealment of an illegitimate child's death was equivalent to murder. The context of how she got pregnant was that she later claimed that she had been seduced by Sir Thomas's grandson Geoffrey, who was 16 or 17 years old. She was 22 and an employee in his family's house. A midwife testified at her trial that the fetus was too underdeveloped to have ever been alive. Green was found guilty anyway. At her own request, several of her friends pulled her swinging body downward as she hung to hasten her death, and a soldier struck her 4 or 5 times with the butt of a musket for the same reason. After half an hour, she was presumed dead, cut down, and given to the University of Oxford physicians William Petty and Thomas Willis for anatomical dissection. When Petty and Willis opened Green's coffin, they found she was breathing, however faintly, and had a pulse. They and 2 colleagues immediately began trying to revive her, prying open her teeth to pour hot cordials down her throat, rubbing her limbs, attempting various treatments. A feather was used to tickle her throat. A woman was persuaded to get into bed with her to share body heat. After 14 hours, Anne Green spoke. The authorities granted her a reprieve and ultimately pardoned her, concluding that the hand of God had intervened to demonstrate her innocence. There was also a practical element, though. Sir Thomas Reed, her prosecutor, died 3 days after her hanging, leaving nobody of consequence to object to the pardon. Green went to stay with friends in the country, taking the coffin she'd been transported in with her as a trophy of her survival. She subsequently married and had 3 children before dying in 1659. 9 years after the state had already killed her once. Another detail worth knowing is that a very similar case occurred 7 years later in the same county. A servant named Elizabeth Russell was hanged for infanticide, taken for dissection, found to be alive, and revived by the surgeons, at which point magistrates had her taken outside and properly hanged from a nearby tree. No pardon for her, sadly. Anne Green survived because of timing, because her prosecutor died, and because enough people decided that it meant something, but Elizabeth Russell didn't get any of that. Fast forward 100 years. Mary Blandy was not a servant. She was born around 1720 into a comfortable middle-class family in Henley-on-Thames. Well-educated, well-regarded. Her father, Francis, was a prosperous lawyer who made one significant miscalculation. Worried that Mary would never find a husband, he advertised a dowry of £10,000 to attract suitors, despite his estate being worth only about £4,000. In 1746, Mary met Captain William Henry Cranston, an army officer and son of a Scottish nobleman. They intended to marry until it was revealed that he already had a wife and child back in Scotland. Francis banned him from seeing Mary. Cranston kept seeing her anyway and eventually sent her a packet of white powder with instructions. He told her it was a Scottish love potion that would make her father more amenable to their relationship. Mary mixed it into her father's tea and gruel. Francis Blandy began suffering symptoms including pricklings in his bowels, his mouth, the nostrils filling with pimples and his teeth rotting out of his head. A servant managed to save some of the powder and take it to a chemist, who identified it as arsenic. On his deathbed, Francis accused Mary of poisoning him. She tearfully begged his forgiveness. When news spread that she might be arrested, she tried to go outside and was attacked by local residents. She fled to the Little Angel Inn in Berkshire before being brought back and arrested. She was imprisoned at Oxford Castle, where her high social status meant some privileges others didn't have. She could host friends for tea, though her ankles remained discreetly shackled. One of the ankle shackles is still on display there. Her trial in March 1752 was notable as the first murder trial to present detailed medical evidence on a charge of poisoning. Dr. Anthony Addington couldn't chemically test for arsenic, the technology didn't exist yet, but he compared the chemical reactions of the powder found in Francis's gruel to known arsenic using 5 different tests, and concluded that he had never seen two things in nature more alike, and she was convicted. On April 6th, 1752, which was actually Easter Monday, Mary Blandy mounted the scaffold. Dressed in black, she climbed the first 5 steps of the ladder and stopped. "Gentlemen," she said, "I beg that you will not hang me high for the sake of decency." She was hanged. Cranston, who had sent her the arsenic and told her it was a love potion, had already fled to France. He died there later that year. Whether he knew exactly what he was sending her or had genuinely deceived himself about it remains somehow an open question. The prison that housed Mary Blandy eventually became H.M. Prison Oxford, ran until 1996, and is now the Malmaison Oxford, a boutique hotel operating inside the former Victorian prison blocks. The hotel has 95 rooms. The cells in A wing have been converted into bedrooms. 3 original cells knocked together to make each room, 2 forming the bedroom and 1 the bathroom. The vaulted ceilings are original, the brick walls are still there painted white, and the heavy studded metal doors open with a creak. One cell on the lower ground floor has been left completely in its original state so guests can see what the rooms actually were. Each of those original cells housed up to 3 prisoners. The rooms that now start at around $200 a night each contain the space that once held 9 people. Malmaison doesn't market itself as a haunted hotel though. Their focus is on authentic history rather than ghost tourism, which is fair enough because the actual history is strange enough without embellishment. You're sleeping in a cell in a building that has been confining, punishing, and occasionally executing people since before England had a parliament. Anne Green was hanged in the yard outside it, survived, and walked away with her coffin. Mary Blandy spent her last weeks in it, asking not to be hung too high for decency's sake. The last public execution at Oxford Castle was in 1863. The building has been continuously in use for human containment in one form or another from 1071 until 1996. It's been a hotel since 2006. That's kind of crazy. Chillingham Castle sits in the far north of Northumberland, a few miles from the Scottish border, in a part of England that for several centuries was essentially a war zone, and not metaphorically, a literal, ongoing, multi-generational war zone where armies passed through regularly, villages got burned, and the castle's entire reason for existing was to stop people from crossing a line on a map. The castle was originally a monastery in the late 12th century. The monarchy placed it in the hands of the Grey family in 1246, who were tasked with holding the border around Chillingham. It was the Greys who turned the monastery into a fortress, constructing its dungeons, battlements, and fortifications. The family would hold the castle for the next 7 centuries, which is a remarkable run considering how many of them the English crown executed along the way. The castle's history includes a record 18 Knights of the Garter, balanced out by no less than 8 family members executed for high treason. They had a habit of picking the wrong side, or more accurately, different family members picked opposite sides and whoever survived had a cousin at court to smooth things over. The castle's walls are up to 12 feet thick in some places. That's crazy. And then there's John Sage. The story goes that John Sage was a soldier who had risen to lieutenant in Edward I's army, was forced to retire after a serious leg injury, and begged the king to find him another role. Edward appointed him chief torturer at Chillingham. Sage was a sadist who particularly hated the Scots. Over 3 years of war, he supposedly tortured 50 prisoners a week. When the war ended, he burned the remaining adult prisoners alive in the castle courtyard while their children watched, then hacked the children to death with an axe. In total, total, 7,500 Scottish prisoners allegedly died at Chillingham. Their bodies were dumped in the castle lake. John Sage's end, according to the legend, came when he strangled his girlfriend Elizabeth Charlton during a sex game on the torture rack. Her father, a powerful border Reaver chieftain, gave the king an ultimatum: execute Sage or lose the Reavers' alliance. Edward handed him over. He was hanged in the castle grounds, and while he was still alive, the crowd cut pieces off of him as souvenirs. It's a great story, but it's also almost certainly not true, or at least not provable. The character of John Sage is not documented in any historical record. His existence cannot be confirmed. The History Collection, one of the more thorough accounts of Chillingham's history, notes that some of the castle's more bloody tales are difficult to verify, and that Chillingham's reputation as Britain's most haunted castle seems to stem largely from its current owners. One researcher who has looked into the ghost tour history of the castle describes John Sage as, quote, one possibly modern addition to the ghostly pantheon of Chillingham, who is, quote, a prominent figure in the ever-popular ghost tours. The 7,500 figure is almost certainly exaggerated by centuries of retelling. To put it in perspective, 7,500 people over 3 years works out to 7 deaths per day, every day, for the entire duration of the Scottish Wars of Independence campaign. The entire Battle of Falkirk, which is the major engagement that Edward I fought in 1298, killed somewhere in the range of 2,000 Scottish soldiers. 7,500 deaths in a single dungeon over 3 years would be one of the largest massacres of the medieval period. It would have been documented extensively. What the castle definitely does have, though, is a dungeon and torture instruments, and centuries of border war violence, and a strategic location that made it the place where captured Scots ended up. But we just don't know if a specific torturer named John Sage ran those dungeons, or if he was just made up. But what is documented, and strange enough on its own, is the Blue Boy. During renovation work on the Pink Room, which is now the private residence of the castle's owners, workers found the skeletal remains of a child inside a 10-foot thick wall. The boy's fingers and fingernails were broken, which indicated he had been bricked into the wall while still alive. He was wearing remnants of blue fabric. Nobody knows who he is, when it happened, or why. For years before the discovery, guests and staff had reported a child's crying coming from the Pink Room at midnight, along with a blue light or aura appearing near the wall. After the bones were discovered and laid to rest in the local cemetery, the cries and blue light apparently stopped. Some people still report feeling a presence in the room. The other ghost with a documented basis is Lady Mary Berkeley. In the 1600s, her husband, Lord Grey of Wark and Chillingham, left her alone in the castle with their infant daughter and ran off with her younger sister. Lady Mary was abandoned and spent years in the castle alone. She died there. Visitors report the hustle of a long dress moving through certain rooms and corridors, along with a sudden cold drop in temperature as if someone's pacing. The castle fell into serious disrepair after World War II. It had been used as an army barracks, and the soldiers had stripped out most of the decorative wood and burned it for warmth. The lead was removed from the roof, causing extensive water damage. In 1982, Sir Humphrey Wakefield bought the castle. His wife Catherine is descended from the original Grey family. He spent decades since in the painstaking restoration. You can actually stay there. Not in the dungeon, though you can tour that, but in apartments within the castle itself. The wild cattle that have lived on the ground since medieval times still wander the enclosed park. The marks in the dungeon walls from prisoners counting their days are still there. Now, I will say, guys, I know this one isn't a hotel. When I started researching it and I found it, I was under the impression it was. That's just my fault. I just thought that it was open to the public and that it was this old torture thing. I just assumed. I made a mistake, but then it was too interesting and I'd already written about it, so I didn't want to, pull back. So sorry about this last one not being technically a hotel, but, it's really interesting still. Next, I'm going to talk about the Copper Queen Motel in Bisbee, Arizona. Bisbee, Arizona is this tiny town in the Mule Mountains, about 8 miles from the Mexican border. At its peak, it was the largest city between Houston and Los Angeles, which sounds insane now because today it's basically just a few thousand people and some art galleries. The whole thing was built on copper. The company that ran the mine, Phelps Dodge, was so dominant that they also owned the hotel, the hospital, the department store, the library, and the town newspaper. They just completely ran the entire town pretty much. They started building the hotel in 1898, had to blast into the side of a mountain to do it, and the walls ended up almost 2 feet thick. It opened in 1902 with an Italianate tile floor, a Tiffany glass ceiling, and a front desk made from tiger oak. John Wayne stayed there, Teddy Roosevelt, Harry Houdini. It's the oldest continuously operating hotel in Arizona. It was opened before Arizona was even technically a state. The mine eventually closed in 1975, and the town mostly emptied out. Artists and retirees moved in for the cheap real estate, and the hotel just kept going. It's been continuously occupied for over 120 years, and somewhere in that time, it picked up some guests who never left. The hotel keeps a logbook where guests write down their experiences, and paranormal investigators who have been through the place reckon that there are up to 16 different entities in the building. 3 of them show up enough that they've basically got names and their own rooms at this point. Now, personally, I don't know if I buy into the paranormal stuff with there being 16 different entities. That sounds kind of crazy, but I don't know. What do you think? The most famous is Julia Lowell. She was a sex worker in the early 1900s. Prostitution was legal in Arizona at the time, and she was working out of rooms on the 3rd floor. She fell in love with one of her clients, and he didn't feel the same, so she sadly ended herself in the hotel. She hanged herself in room 315, and that room is named after her now. The thing about Julia is that, according to the legend and the records, she's weirdly specific in who she bothers. She only interacts with men, doesn't matter if they're guests or staff. She whispers in their ears, messes with their feet while they sleep, and has been seen dancing at the bottom of the main staircase. One woman apparently caught her off guard by turning a corner too fast, and Julia's response was to go, "Oh, have you seen anything?" before disappearing, which is a weird thing for a ghost to say. The logbook entries get pretty specific. A guest named Bob wrote on February 2nd, 2000, quote, "I woke up at 4 a.m. and saw Julia sitting on top of the enclosed TV cabinet, legs crossed, with her black dress line beside her." And then there's the bathroom. Room 315 has no exhaust fan, so it steams up heavily after a shower. One morning, a female guest got out, looked in the mirror, and "I see you" was written in the steam. She photographed it and ran downstairs to show the owner. He said it wasn't the first time someone had seen those words in that mirror, just the first time that anyone had ever brought him proof. The second one is a kid named Billy. Nobody actually knows who he is. The hotel thinks he was the child of a former employee who drowned in the San Pedro River nearby, but they've never been able to confirm that. Staff leave toys out for him, and a large toy car has been seen moving on its own. Adults can't see Billy, but children can, and they can play with him just like he's a normal kid. Adults mostly hear him, running in the hallways, giggling. The owner's daughter, Jenna, described waking up, quote, 3 nights in a row hearing running back and forth at the foot of the bed. "I left candy on one side of the bed, and in the morning it looked like it had been dragged underneath." The water thing is creepy. He'd been heard crying whenever guests run the shower or fill the bath, and people have found the word "help" written in the steam on bathroom mirrors. Given that he drowned, that tracks in a pretty uncomfortable way. The third is just some guy nobody's been able to identify. Staff call him Howard. Older man, long hair, beard, top hat, black cape, and an overwhelming smell of cigar smoke that hits before you see anything. He mostly hangs around the 4th floor. Room 401 separately has a reputation as having a negative presence. A former owner of the hotel died in there. The logbook has good Howard entries. Guest Paul, August 2008, quote, "I looked up at the 3rd floor balcony and saw a tall man in a long black coat look out the window and lean back in. Then he was gone." Guest Marisa, September 2002, quote, "I was reading the articles in the hallway display case and noticed in the reflection a gentleman had stopped behind me and was reading over my shoulder. He seemed like a very nice person, so I turned to say hello, but there was no one there." And beyond those 3, the logbook has stuff that doesn't fit any of them. Doors slamming, phantom phone calls, pictures flying off walls, cameras and phones dying suddenly. Someone took a photo at a kid's birthday party at the hotel, and there were 2 little girls in the background that nobody recognized or had seen during the event. But I mean, I don't know. I feel like a lot of this is bullshit. I mean, it's a good story, but I've been looking around at this for a while, and I mean, I don't know. I can't even find the image that they're talking about, the photograph. I mean, if my editor can find it, then, you know, put it up. But I don't know. Okay, and with the rest of the time in this video, I think I want to read some Reddit people. Not Reddit stories like fake ones, but like an Ask Reddit thread of people talking about their scary hotel experiences. So I found this Ask Reddit thread: "To all Reddit travelers, what is your creepiest hotel story?" And I just wanted to read some of these because I wanted to get some more modern and very anecdotal, you know, accounts of scary hotel stories. And also, I can't forget my roots, you know, as a Reddit guy. First, I'm gonna read this one from Chief K Hump. Found a hotel in Yangon, Burma, the day we got there for pretty cheap. They mentioned the rates were low because maintenance was being done on several floors. We sleep fine, wake up, and head to breakfast. At breakfast, we met some Germans who had also stayed the night in our hotel. They said they had not slept well because during the middle of the night, someone woke them up to move them from the floor they were on. We, us and the Germans, found out later that they had been moved because they were on one of the levels reserved for maintenance, and a part of the maintenance included gassing the rooms for bugs. During the middle of the night, they were just going around the rooms shoving the gas nozzle or whatever under the doors and letting them run. Wound up killing the two people next to the Germans before they realized they'd accidentally booked people on that floor. We weren't on that floor thankfully, but it's always stuck with me how seemingly easy it could have been to have gotten mixed up in that. Oh my god, that's that's terrifying. People can be so dumb. Like, human error is the biggest predictor of like scary things like actually happening. That's like so fucked up. Next one from ghost_farter, which is a great username by the way. Stayed in a B&B in Pennsylvania that seemed cute enough. They did have a wall of antique dolls in the main room, but otherwise no signs of weirdness. That's until we were settled in the room. I noticed some scratches on the floor near a bookcase, and after some inspection realized it was a secret door. When I asked the owner, who gave a creepy vibe, if it worked, he said yes, and showed me that it opened to their office, which was a cluttered room with a computer and piles of crap. It had a lock on their side, and when I asked if there was a lock on my side, he smiled and said no. When I showed some concern that there was an unlockable entrance to my room that was camouflaged that they didn't tell me about, he just kept smiling. So that night, no sex, fear of cameras, and I barricaded the fucking door and barely slept. Edit, it was many years ago before Facebook or Twitter, so we're racking our brains to remember the name. It was near New Hope, Pennsylvania is all I can remember at this point. Edit 2, New Hope is a lovely except creepy place. That is creepy as fuck, and that is the kind of shit that you'd expect from like little small B&Bs like that. But it's part of the fun, you know, it's part of the fun. That's a joke, by the way. Wait, that's a joke. Next one from Beside Myself 300. Did the couchsurfing.com thing with a friend a few years ago. We are both big guys, so typically feel safe everywhere we go. Show up at the house, 60-year-old guy opens the door while on the phone. He's wearing only sweatpants. He signals for us to enter. He continues his conversation and ends with an "I love you." He turns to us and says welcome and apologizes for being on the phone. He starts talking about his girlfriend, who he was talking with, and how she lives overseas. He mentions he has several girlfriends and boasts about being a ladies' man. He then starts to show us pictures. These girls looked like they were 14. While sliding through the pic, he accidentally showed us one of their passports. That weirded us out a lot. We were early 20s and didn't really know what to do, so we said we were tired and wanted to sleep. He walked us to the room while rubbing his belly, told us he would make us breakfast in the morning. We decided to sleep the night but leave before he woke up. My friend slept on the bedroom door so he couldn't sneak in. We got up super early and bolted. We got super weird vibes from the guy and just felt gross or weird about the whole thing. That is terrifying. Like, that's like, I mean, not terrifying, but that's just like weird and creepy. That is some shit that like sounds like the start to a no sleep story, you know? Like, not the whole thing, but that sounds like the start to a no sleep story. Next is one from Never Penniless. I arrive at a secluded coastal hotel south of Marmaris, Turkey, around 2 a.m. It had been a long day in Istanbul, followed by a flight and long bus ride into Marmaris, where I haggled with non-English speaking taxi drivers, who were not even aware that this small resort exists. When the taxi pulls up on the hotel, it's on fire. When the owner, standing out front, sees us, he opens the taxi door excitedly. "You come, I have nice room for you." I point out that the hotel is on fire, but he simply gestures and says, "Small fire, no problem, you come." I am utterly exhausted. I find myself following the owner into the hotel, stepping over fire hoses, waving away smoke, passing firefighters as they run up and down a very nice staircase. We pause at the second floor landing and the owner tells me, "See, fire only on this side of hotel. This side no fire, you come." My exhaustion removes every ounce of common sense, and I follow him into a room down the hall. The room is indeed fire-free. I quickly scan the "in case of fire" message on the back of the door, check the window escape, and promptly pass out with my gear and boots on. In the morning, I awake, alive, wondering if I dreamt the whole thing. I go down the smoky stairs past the charred hard other side of the hotel. The owner is so happy to see me, still alive, that he eats breakfast with me. I went back a few years later and the hotel had fully recovered. See, that's just, like, good hotel work, I guess, right? The next post I'm gonna read comes from Sweet Rhyme Pure Reason. When I was 12, I was staying in a motel with my mom on a road trip. We were in the middle of nowhere in Texas at a motel that had a decent rating in our guidebook that was really cheap, so we went for it. In the middle of the night, the owner knocked on the door and told us we had to leave because he wanted the room for someone else. My mom was outside arguing with him while I was gathering our things, and I was terrified because I heard him start yelling. I looked out the window and saw half a dozen bikers in vests appear out of nowhere, maybe a nearby room, and start confronting the owner. My mom came inside quickly and we watched them start harassing the guy. Things like, "She's paid to be here. You're gonna let her stay here tonight. We don't ever want to hear shit like this from you again." And the owner kept saying things like, "I don't want any trouble." Everybody left fairly quickly, and we didn't ever hear anything about it the next day at checkout. We weren't able to sleep very well because we were so shook up, but it was better than getting in the car again. Thank you, anonymous biker gang. This is actually pretty wholesome, as the top reply from I Can't Know That says, unexpectedly wholesome, and I totally agree. This is actually a kind of creepy but mostly sweet story. This next one comes from Crow_man. Was in San Juan del Sur, Nicaragua last year. Massive spiders all over the room. Even woke up with a couple of little scorpions in my bed the first morning. Next night, I'm sitting at the bar, drinking and chatting with a mate. Feel a tickle on the back of my neck and think it's a mosquito or something. Brush the back of my neck and another motherfucking scorpion, this time way bigger, plops on the ground at my feet. Stared at it for a moment in shock, squealed like a girl, squashed it, and kept drinking. Now, I do not blame this crow man for squealing like a girl. I mean, I would too. Massive spiders, I am out of that fucking hotel room. Hell no. Anyway, moving on. This next one comes from Ragna the Great. In Mexico, my girlfriend and I stayed a night in a hut in the jungle. No running water, no electricity. As we are from Central Europe, we're not used to dangerous wildlife. Spiders, scorpions, etc. There was a beautiful cenote nearby, and at some point it rained like crazy. The daytime was amazing. The night, not so much. In our hut was a bed with a mosquito net with huge holes in it. It was pitch black in the hut as we laid down and got comfortable trying to sleep. I was a bit creeped out and decided to check for insects with my phone's flashlight. Bad idea. There were hundreds of big spiders all over the walls and ceiling. This is horrifying. This is like my worst nightmare. I hate camping for this reason. I personally, I love camping, but I can't sleep in a tent because the fucking bugs and especially spiders, I can't do that shit. But anyway, props to you, Ragnar the Great, for still sleeping there that night. Like, holy fuck. This shit smells like bullshit. And that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you want to see next in the comments, and be sure to subscribe or follow wherever you are. And everyone, have a great night. Sleep well, and sweet dreams.